Hi there, this is John Wilkinson again from History Made Easier, and having devoted a presentation to the Western Front in 1914, here's one looking at what was happening elsewhere in the same year. The Eastern Fronts, stretching some 1,600 kilometres, were much more fluid than in the West throughout the war, with gains and counter-gains. The sheer amount of space on the Eastern Front allowed for armies' flanks, or else a weakly held front, to be attacked. But the sheer size and the undeveloped nature of the territory gave massive logistical problems for armies trying to move along, or else move supplies along, tracks rather than roads. And there was the weather. Scorching hot summers and bitterly cold winters, and, like the Western Front, rain. We can say that Austria-Hungary performed badly and showed itself to be a power in its death throes. Russia at first did well, but when early successes in East Prussia were decisively overturned by the Germans, defeat quickly turned into a rout, and the inefficiencies, indeed the sheer incompetence of Tsarism, was not for the first time made glaringly evident. Germany, at first taken by surprise, recovered, and was much more successful in the East than was the case in the West. Austria-Hungary began the war with a bombardment of Belgrade from gunboats on the river Danube, near the end of July, and ground forces moved into Serbia 2 weeks later. And to the surprise of just about everybody, they were pushed out of Serbia, only to again invade the country in September. The Austro-Hungarian forces, though at this point they had to divert forces to face the Russians, had a massive advantage in that the Serbs had little artillery and even less shells, and the Austro-Hungarians regained the upper hand and occupied Belgrade for a couple of weeks at the beginning of December, only to again be forced out of Serbia entirely. Serbia, however, had lost almost 100,000 men, and a typhus epidemic killed more. These were losses Serbia couldn't sustain. In East Prussia, Germany might have been surprised by the strength of the Russian initial thrust, but when Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff took command, replacing General Previtz, who had panicked, they were able to take control of the campaign in the east. Hindenburg had been brought out of retirement. Ludendorff, on whom the German High Command placed its hopes, was made his chief of staff. Their appointments, however, were recognition of the fact that Germany was already facing what it had planned to avoid: a war on two fronts. The speedy Russian mobilization, helped by the decision to attack without waiting for their reserves, had achieved that much. And the Russians still outnumbered the Germans by roughly 2-1. The Russians moved their First Army into East Prussia north of the Masurian Lakes, whilst its Second Army moved south of the lakes, and the Russian First Army pushed the Germans back. Ludendorff took a calculated risk and moved his men to take on the Russian Second Army first. The Germans were helped in their planning by the interceptions of Russian transmissions, which incredibly were unencrypted. They were also helped by Moltke's decision to transfer men from the Western Front, much as it didn't help matters there. With the Russian Second Army forced to lose contact as it navigated the lakes and the woods of the region, it was surrounded and crushed at Tannenberg. And then its First Army too was crushed at the Masurian lakes, even though the Germans were still outnumbered. The Russian army, its communications in complete disorder, was unprepared for modern war, and more than 100,000 men were killed, and almost 200,000 prisoners were taken. Others fled in complete disarray. After the Battle of Tannenberg, the Russian general Alexander Samsonov went into a forest and shot himself. No disrespect to the general, but what was more important was that the Germans filled 60 trains with captured Russian guns, equipment and horses. From this point on, in the northeast, Russia would be left fighting mostly a rearguard action, with very poor morale. On the Galician front, a region that is today partly Polish and partly Ukraine, but in 1914 was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, 4 Russian armies clashed with 3 Austro-Hungarian armies. This was old-style warfare, with infantry and cavalry seeking to exploit each other's flanks or any weak points that exposed themselves in the course of the battle. Austria-Hungary suffered 325,000 casualties, Russia 225,000. That gives you a sense of the scale. The Russians pushed the Austro-Hungarian forces back, so that Krakow, and from there Germany's industrialized Silesia, were under threat. Consequently, the Germans created another army, the Ninth Army, and Hindenburg, now commander-in-chief of the Eastern armies, and Ludendorff, his chief of staff, were put in command of it. They might still have faced disaster, but for the good fortune that they captured Russia's plans, as well as again intercepting Russian communications. And instead of falling into the trap that the Russians had set them, rapidly shifted their army, German railways enabling them to do so, and were able to hold off the Russian advance. Ludendorff then ill-advisedly pushed to make a breakthrough in December, with the loss of 100,000 men. On the Eastern fronts, casualties were staggering, even greater than in France. Austria-Hungary had lost 500,000 men by the end of the year, dead, injured or captured. They would also lose 800,000 men, including the last of their trained reserves, in the 1914-15 Carpathian Mountains winter campaign. Germany lost another 140,000 men, but this paled in comparison to Russia, which had lost almost 2 million men, more than 750,000 of them taken prisoner. Remember, this is the first year of the war. What should you take away from this? That on all fronts, the war in 1914 was one of manoeuvre. That already lessons were being learned. We will see a stubbornness in 1915 and 1916, but even in those dark years, lessons continued to be learned. That they weren't is a myth. That already Germany had been obliged to come to Austria-Hungary's aid, further stretching its limited resources in the process. But the most important thing to note is the already huge numbers of casualties at a level already unsustainable. Now don't forget that I may have tutorial slots available if you are interested in that. just get your parents to email me at historymadeeasier@gmail.com and we'll see if we can sort something out. I will only charge a reasonable price. I'm not in this to make a fortune. Just as well. Anyway, thank you so much for listening and the best of luck with your studies. Cheers.